Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I am your temporary host, James Peter, and it's an honor to be with such a great family, more precious than gold and diamonds. Here's a beautiful Saturday prayer for the Mr. Peter Stories family. May your hearts be filled with love, your homes with peace, and your lives with endless blessings. Now I have one question. Are you satisfied with my performance? Am I doing better or worse? Comment yes if you agree, and no if you disagree. All right, let's take attendance. Are you present? Comment below. Now let's dive into today's story. With love. The autumn air caressed Shiloh Jolie's face as she stepped from the yellow taxi onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk. Her simple cotton dress fluttered around her knees, drawing curious glances from passing students adorned in designer labels and luxury accessories. The towering structures of New York University loomed before her, a stark contrast to the sprawling farmlands she called home. Inhaling deeply, she savored the unfamiliar scents of the city. Concrete warmed by sunlight, street vendor pretzels, perfumes from passing pedestrians, and that indefinable energy that seemed to pulse through New York's very foundation. This world of steel and glass was a universe away from the fertile fields of her father's agricultural empire, yet she stood tall, unintimidated by its grandeur. Remember who you are, her father had told her just yesterday, his calloused hands, still rough despite his billions, gripping her shoulders with gentle firmness. Your worth isn't in your wallet, but in your character. The moment you start flashing money to gain respect is the moment you've lost it. Those words echoed in her mind as she paid the taxi driver with carefully counted bills from her modest allowance. Jonathan Jolie could have easily provided his only daughter with a private limousine, a penthouse apartment, and a platinum credit card without feeling the slightest financial pinch. His agricultural innovations had transformed Jolie Agricultural Enterprises into a global powerhouse worth billions, with holdings stretching across 3 continents and technologies that had revolutionized sustainable farming practices worldwide. Yet here stood his daughter in last season's dress, carrying a second-hand laptop, preparing to share a dormitory room like any ordinary student. Such was the Jolie way. Wealth was a responsibility, not a badge to be flaunted. Shiloh adjusted the worn leather strap of her shoulder bag, containing textbooks purchased with her own carefully budgeted funds. Her long, elegant fingers, inherited from her late mother, brushed against the handmade bracelet her father had given her as a parting gift. The simple arrangement of wooden beads and a single freshwater pearl held more value to her than any diamond necklace could. She watched as other freshmen arrived, many emerging from luxury vehicles, their arms laden with designer luggage and the latest electronic devices. Their expressions contained varying mixtures of excitement, apprehension, and entitlement. Shiloh understood the first 2 emotions intimately, but the third remained foreign to her nature, despite her privileged upbringing. "Excuse me," she asked a passing student whose ID card hung prominently around his neck. "Could you direct me to the East Residence Hall?" The young man barely glanced at her, his eyes dismissively scanning her simple attire before jerking his thumb toward a red brick building across the quadrangle. "Over there. Registration tables are set up in the lobby." He hurried away without waiting for her thanks. Shiloh smiled slightly, unperturbed by the dismissal. She'd experienced similar reactions from those who mistook her understated appearance for poverty rather than choice. Their assumptions said more about them than about her. The residence hall bustled with activity, parents fussing over reluctant children, roommates meeting for the first time, resident advisors distributing keys and information packets. Shiloh approached the check-in desk with quiet confidence. "Name?" asked a harried student worker without looking up from her computer. "Jolie. Shiloh Jolie." Something in her tone, perhaps the subtle assurance of someone accustomed to being heard, made the worker glance up. For a brief moment, recognition flickered across her face. Jolie? As in ... Yes, Shiloh replied simply, offering no elaboration. The worker's demeanor shifted subtly. You're in room 342, East Tower. Your roommate hasn't arrived yet. She slid a key across the counter, her expression now tinged with curiosity. If you need anything, Miss Jolie, please don't hesitate to ask. Shiloh accepted the key with a gracious nod. Thank you. I'm sure everything will be fine. Navigating the elevator and hallways, she found room 342 with minimal difficulty. The space revealed itself to be exactly what she'd expected: functional, small, with twin beds and basic furnishings. Nothing like her spacious bedroom at home, with its panoramic views of verdant fields, but sufficient for her needs. She claimed the bed near the window, unpacking methodically. Clothes into the narrow closet, books organized on the desk, toiletries arranged in the shared bathroom. Lastly, she removed a framed photograph from careful wrapping and placed it beside her bed. The image showed her sitting on a tractor with her father, both of them laughing, the vast fields stretching behind them to the horizon. It was her touchstone, her reminder of who she was beneath the veneer of a simple college student. From her window, Shiloh watched the campus pulse with activity, mentally preparing for the path ahead. She had enrolled in complex business courses, determined to understand every aspect of international trade and sustainable agriculture. Someday she would take the reins of Jolie Agricultural Enterprises and expand its mission of feeding communities while respecting the land. As twilight descended over Manhattan, transforming the cityscape into a constellation of artificial stars, Shiloh opened her laptop and composed an email to her father. I've arrived safely, Father. The university is impressive, though the city feels like a different planet compared to home. I already miss the smell of earth after rain and the sound of absolute silence at dawn, but I'm ready for this new challenge. No one here knows who I truly am, and that's exactly how I want it. I'm just another student. Not a Jolie, not an heiress, just Shiloh. I'll make you proud, as I promised Mother before she left us. The values you both instilled remain my compass. She sent the message and then reached for her course materials, already preparing for classes that wouldn't begin for another 3 days. In the Jolie household, preparation wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Excellence demanded foresight and diligence. A soft knock interrupted her studies. Opening the door, she discovered a tall young woman with vibrant red hair and an armful of suitcases. Hi, I'm Emma Watson. No relation to the actress, unfortunately, the young woman announced with breathless enthusiasm. I guess we're roommates? I was expecting someone named... She consulted a crumpled paper. Shiloh. That's me, Shiloh confirmed, stepping aside to allow Emma entry. Shiloh Jolie. Welcome. Emma bustled into the room, her energy seeming to expand to fill every corner. Oh wow, you're super organized already. Sorry I'm so late. My flight from Chicago was delayed, then the taxi took forever, and I'm pretty sure the driver took the longest route possible to run up the meter. She deposited her belongings in a colorful heap on the unclaimed bed. I'm studying fashion merchandising, by the way. What about you? Business administration with a focus on agricultural economics, Shiloh replied, helping Emma organize her chaotic arrival. Emma paused mid-unpacking. Agricultural economics? That sounds specific. Family business? Shiloh nodded, maintaining her practiced discretion. Something like that? My father works in farming. Cool. My dad's a surgeon. Boring, right? Everybody's dad is either a doctor, lawyer, or banker. Farming is different. Emma continued unpacking, chattering about her hometown, her high school achievements, and her aspirations to work for a major fashion house. Shiloh listened attentively, appreciating Emma's straightforward friendliness. Here was someone who clearly took people at face value, without calculation or agenda. Perhaps, Shiloh reflected, this arrangement would work well after all. Later that night, as Emma's gentle snores filled their shared space, Shiloh stood by the window, gazing at the unfamiliar skyline. The stars were barely visible through the city's light pollution, another stark difference from home, where the night sky blazed with celestial brilliance. She thought about the journey ahead, not just the academic challenges, but the social landscape she would need to navigate. In this environment, she was determined to succeed or fail based on her own merits, not her family name or fortune. It would be a cleansing experience to be judged solely on who she was, not what she possessed. As she finally slipped into bed, Shiloh felt a curious mixture of anticipation and resolve. New York University represented more than education. It offered a proving ground for her identity apart from the Jolie legacy. Here she could test her father's philosophy that true worth came from character rather than currency. Morning would bring orientation, new faces, unknown challenges. But for now, Shiloh closed her eyes, allowing the unfamiliar symphony of city sounds to lull her into dreams of both the home she'd left behind and the future she came to claim. Little did she know that destiny had already set in motion events that would test her principles and resilience far beyond anything she had anticipated. Somewhere else in Manhattan, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, her future was being discussed by men whose plans would irrevocably alter the carefully constructed boundaries between her two worlds. Chapter 2. The Campus King. The growl of the Ferrari's 12-cylinder engine reverberated through the underground parking structure as Stephen Waugh navigated toward his usual spot, unofficially reserved through a combination of social intimidation and a generous annual donation to the parking attendant. The sleek machine, a birthday gift from his father 2 years ago, had long since lost its novelty, but the attention it commanded remained a currency Stephen valued highly. He killed the engine and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting the deliberately tousled strands of his chestnut hair. At 28, Stephen Waugh possessed the kind of effortless good looks that opened doors before his family name even registered. Strong jawline softened by sensual lips, piercing blue eyes that could charm or intimidate with equal effectiveness, and a physique maintained by expensive personal trainers rather than genuine discipline. Another year, another batch of willing admirers, observed Marcus Blackwood, unfolding his lanky frame from the passenger seat. His British accent, cultivated during a single semester at Oxford before being politely asked to leave, added an air of sophistication to even his most crude observations. Stephen's lips curved into a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. The campus ecosystem resets itself every fall, fresh faces, fresh opportunities. Speaking of fresh, Marcus nodded toward a group of new students clutching orientation packets near the entrance. The scholarship cases are always easy to spot. Stephen's chuckle carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never known limitation. Designer knockoffs and wide-eyed gratitude, a depressing combination. He extracted his imported leather briefcase from the trunk, its contents more likely to contain premium cologne than academic materials. The September sun bathed the university quadrangle in golden light as they emerged from the parking structure, transforming the historic campus into a scene worthy of a promotional brochure. Students flowed around them like water around stones, many offering deferential nods or hopeful smiles as Stephen passed. His reputation preceded him, heir to the Waugh financial empire, campus playboy, fixture at exclusive Manhattan nightclubs, and despite mediocre academic performance, somehow always in the good graces of the administration. "Mr. Waugh," called Professor Hamilton, a silver-haired economics instructor hurrying across the lawn. "A moment, if you please." Stephen suppressed a sigh of irritation, maintaining his charming facade. Professor, good to see you. Enjoy your summer in the Hamptons? Very much so, thank you. Your father's recommendation for that sailing instructor was spot on. The professor beamed, adjusting his bow tie. I wanted to discuss your thesis proposal before classes officially begin. Perhaps you could stop by my office later this week? Of course, Stephen agreed smoothly, having no intention of doing so until absolutely necessary. I'll have my assistant schedule something. Excellent, excellent. And Marcus, I trust you'll be joining us for advanced financial modeling this semester? Your final paper last spring showed remarkable creativity. Marcus smirked. Wouldn't miss it, sir. As Hamilton continued toward the administration building, Marcus leaned closer to Stephen. My remarkable creativity involved paying a graduate student $2,000 to write that paper. Money well spent, Stephen replied, checking his watch. A Patek Philippe that cost more than most professors' monthly salaries. We should make an appearance at the welcome mixer tonight. The dean always notes who attends these things. Their path toward the business school building took them past the library steps, where clusters of students sat between classes. Stephen's attention caught on an unfamiliar figure seated alone, absorbed in a textbook. Something about her stillness amid the campus bustle triggered his curiosity. A young woman with rich, dark skin and elegant features, dressed simply but with an indefinable air of dignity. Unlike most female students who tracked his movements across campus, she seemed utterly oblivious to his presence. New face, Stephen murmured, slowing his pace. Transfer student, Marcus followed his gaze. Farm girl, I heard. Some scholarship case from down south. Apparently brilliant, but clearly lacking in the finer points of social awareness. Look at those shoes. Practical rather than fashionable. Tragic. Stephen observed her more carefully, noting the absence of designer labels or ostentatious accessories that typically signaled a student's social standing. Her beauty was understated but undeniable, high cheekbones, full lips, and an almost regal posture that somehow elevated her simple cotton dress. Farm girl, he repeated thoughtfully. Interesting. Don't tell me you're actually considering slumming, Marcus laughed. Even for you, that would be remarkable. Stephen's expression hardened slightly. I'm merely contemplating a proper welcome to our illustrious institution. Someone should educate her about the social hierarchy here before she embarrasses herself. Always the philanthropist, Marcus quipped. Shall we introduce ourselves now? No, Stephen decided, his lips curving into a smile that contained nothing of warmth. Let's allow anticipation to build. Tomorrow will be soon enough. The remainder of the day passed in a familiar rhythm of minimal academic engagement and maximum social maneuvering. Stephen held court on the business school terrace, surrounded by returning students eager to associate with his aura of privilege and connection. He obliged with carefully edited tales of summer exploits, yacht parties in Saint-Tropez, private clubs in Dubai, high-stakes poker games in Monte Carlo, omitting the moments of crushing emptiness that followed each fleeting pleasure. Evening found him at his penthouse apartment, preparing for the dean's reception with practiced precision. The space, paid for by his father but featured in an architectural magazine under Stephen's name, showcased sophisticated minimalism that belied its astronomical cost. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan's glittering skyline, the perfect backdrop for the carefully curated image he projected to the world. As his private driver navigated through evening traffic toward campus, Stephen reviewed his mental checklist for the reception. Charm the dean, flatter key professors, identify potential new connections, maintain appropriate distance from overeager female students while encouraging just enough hope to keep options open. The campus ballroom had been transformed for the occasion, with elegant floral arrangements and subtle lighting, creating an atmosphere of refined celebration. Stephen moved through the space with practiced ease, a flute of champagne in hand, dispensing greetings and compliments with calculated generosity. "Stephen, there you are," called Dean Whitman, gesturing him toward a small group near the buffet. "I was just telling Judge Harrington about your summer internship at the Federal Reserve. Such impressive insights in your final presentation." Stephen smoothly joined the conversation, neglecting to mention that his impressive insights had been borrowed from a financial analyst whose career depended on the Wall family's goodwill. "It was an invaluable experience, sir, though I must credit my professors for the theoretical foundation that made it possible." The evening progressed predictably until Stephen noticed a ripple of interest near the entrance. The farm girl had arrived, looking somewhat out of place in her simple dress among the cocktail attire of other attendees. Yet something in her bearing commanded attention, a quiet confidence that seemed impervious to the curious glances and whispered comments. "Who invited the scholarship case?" Marcus murmured, materializing at Stephen's elbow with a fresh drink. "Don't these events usually require a certain standard?" Stephen observed her thoughtfully. "Perhaps she's someone's charitable project, or maybe—" He paused as Professor Rodriguez, the notoriously demanding head of agricultural economics, approached her with evident warmth. "She's more connected than she appears." "Rodriguez actually seems pleased to see her," Marcus noted with surprise. "I didn't think that man experienced positive emotions." "Curiouser and curiouser," Stephen mused. "I think it's time we properly welcomed this mysterious newcomer to our little community." He moved through the crowd with deliberate casualness, timing his approach to intercept her path to the refreshment table. The collision, when it occurred, appeared entirely accidental, his shoulder brushing against hers just firmly enough to make her stumble slightly. "Oh, pardon me," Stephen apologized with rehearsed sincerity, steadying her with a hand that lingered slightly longer than necessary. "These events always become so crowded. Stephen Wall," he introduced himself, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone unaccustomed to rejection. "I know who you are," she replied, her voice carrying a subtle southern lilt that transformed the simple statement into something almost musical. She accepted his handshake briefly, but made no effort to offer her own name. Stephen's smile remained fixed despite the unexpected response. "Then you have the advantage. You are currently trying to reach the water pitcher," she replied with polite firmness, stepping around him. The dismissal, so subtle yet definitive, caught Stephen off guard. People, especially women, didn't walk away from Stephen Waugh mid-conversation. They certainly didn't dismiss his practiced charm as if it were an irrelevant distraction. "You must be new here," he persisted, following her to the refreshment table. "Allow me to offer some friendly advice about navigating campus social circles. They can be quite hierarchical." She turned, dark eyes assessing him with disconcerting directness. "Is that so? And where exactly would you place yourself in this hierarchy, Mr. Waugh?" The question, asked without a trace of flirtation or deference, triggered an unfamiliar discomfort. "Experience suggests I'm rather near the top," he replied with a confidence that suddenly felt hollow. "Family connections, social capital, the usual metrics." "How fascinating," she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Where I come from, hierarchies are based on character and contribution, not inherited position." Before Stephen could formulate a response, Professor Rodriguez approached, placing a paternal hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Ah, Shiloh, I see you're meeting your classmates. Mr. Wall will be in your Advanced Market Economics seminar this semester." "Shiloh," Stephen repeated, finally having a name to attach to the enigma before him. "Unusual name." "Named for a place of peace," she replied, her expression softening as she addressed the professor. "Doctor, Rodriguez was just telling me about the department's research into sustainable market models for developing agricultural communities. Fascinating topic, Stephen interjected smoothly. My family's investment firm has several initiatives in emerging markets. Initiatives that prioritize profit over sustainability, if memory serves, Rodriguez commented dryly. Perhaps Ms. Jolie's perspective will provide valuable counterbalance in class discussions. Stephen filed away the surname, determined to research this unexpected challenge to his social dominance. The evening continued, but his attention repeatedly drifted to Shiloh Jolie, who moved through the reception with quiet dignity, engaging substantively with faculty while most students focused on superficial networking. Later that night, as his driver returned him to his penthouse, Stephen found himself uncharacteristically preoccupied. The farm girl, Shiloh, had disrupted his carefully constructed worldview with nothing more than calm self-possession and direct assessment. In a social ecosystem where he had long reigned unchallenged, she represented an unquantifiable variable. Entering his expansive but emotionally empty apartment, Stephen poured himself a generous measure of scotch and moved to the window wall overlooking the city. Tomorrow, he decided, would require a more direct approach to establishing the proper dynamic between them. No one, especially not a scholarship student from nowhere, would disrupt the social order he had so carefully cultivated. Little did Stephen Waugh realize that his encounter with Shiloh Jolie had set in motion events that would fundamentally alter the foundations of his privileged existence. In the penthouses of Manhattan, powerful men were already making decisions that would intertwine their destinies in ways neither could anticipate. Chapter 3. The Ultimatum. Richard Waugh's office occupies the entire top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city he considers his personal chessboard. The decor speaks of old money, leather-bound books, oil paintings of stern ancestors, furniture crafted from trees older than the nation itself. When Stephen enters, his father doesn't look up from the documents spread across his antique desk. "You're late," Richard observes, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man who values each second of his time. Stephen drops into a leather chair without waiting for an invitation. Traffic was brutal. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until Sunday dinner? Richard finally raises his gaze, steel gray eyes assessing his son with the same clinical detachment he applies to failing investments. He slides a black credit card statement across the polished wood. "Explain this." Stephen glances at the document without touching it. The total at the bottom, $72,436, doesn't surprise him. September was a busy month. Indeed. Richard leans back, steepling his fingers. 20,000 at Bergdorf Goodman, 15,000 at that nightclub in the meatpacking district, 30,000 at a jewelry store. His eyebrow arches. "I don't recall seeing any jewelry on your mother recently." "It wasn't for mother," Stephen says, a hint of defiance coloring his tone. "Clearly." Richard's lips press into a thin line. "And where is this recipient of your generosity now?" Stephen shifts uncomfortably. Angelique, or was it Angeline, had moved on to a Brazilian soccer player within weeks of receiving the diamond bracelet. "That's not relevant." "On the contrary, it's entirely relevant to the discussion we're about to have." Richard rises, moving to the window to survey his domain. "You're 28 years old, Stephen. At your age, I had already established the foundation of Waugh Investments, married your mother, and begun planning for the family's future." "Different times," Stephen mutters, reaching for the crystal decanter of scotch on the side table. Richard turns, his expression hardening. "Put that down. You'll want a clear head for this conversation." Something in his father's tone makes Stephen comply, an unfamiliar sensation of unease creeping up his spine. "I've been patient," Richard continues. "I allowed you to find yourself. After Princeton, 5 years of finding yourself in nightclubs and on beaches, while your trust fund financed the search. I secured your place in that master's program, despite academic qualifications that were mediocre at best. I've turned a blind eye to the revolving door of inappropriate companions, the gambling debts, the embarrassing headlines. He returns to his desk, pressing his palms flat against the wood. My patience has expired. Stephen forces a laugh. What are you going to do? Cut me off? We both know that's an empty threat. The Wall name would be dragged through every tabloid in the country. Not an empty threat, a reality, as of this moment. Richard opens a drawer and removes a folder thick with documents. Your accounts have been frozen, your credit cards cancelled. Access to all properties owned by the family trust, including your apartment, has been revoked. The blood drains from Stephen's face. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. Richard pushes the folder toward his son. However, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to complete disinheritance. Stephen stares at the folder as if it might contain a venomous snake. What kind of alternative? Marriage. The word hangs in the air like a guillotine blade. Marriage, Stephen repeats, convinced he's misheard, to the daughter of a business associate, a strategic alliance that will benefit both families. Richard sits, his posture unyielding. The wedding will take place 1 month from today. Upon signing the marriage contract, you'll receive a position in the company commensurate with your education and abilities. Not your surname. You'll be expected to work, Stephen. Actually work? Stephen's laugh holds an edge of hysteria. This is insane. We're not living in the 16th century. You can't just arrange my marriage like I'm some medieval prince. I'm not arranging your marriage. I'm offering you a choice. Richard's voice remains steady. Accept this path, or make your own way in the world without the Wall fortune to cushion your fall. Who is she? Stephen demands, rising to pace the office like a caged animal. Some ugly heiress no one else will marry? Some social climber desperate for our name? Richard's expression doesn't change, but a dangerous chill enters his voice. You'll show respect when speaking of your future bride. She's an accomplished young woman from a family with impeccable credentials, both social and financial. The match is advantageous for both parties. I refuse, Stephen declares, crossing his arms like a petulant child. You can't force me to marry someone I've never met. You're right. I can't force you. Richard closes the folder. The choice is entirely yours. Choose marriage and responsibility, or choose independence, true independence, without the safety net you've relied on your entire life. Stephen stares at his father, searching for any sign of flexibility. Finding none, he sinks back into the chair. I want to meet her first, before I agree to anything. You already have. A ghost of a smile touches Richard's lips. The engagement dinner is tomorrow night at Le Bernardin. 8 o'clock sharp. Don't be late. As Stephen leaves the office, the weight of his father's ultimatum presses on his shoulders. For the first time in his privileged existence, he finds himself facing a future without guaranteed comfort, a prospect more terrifying than he cares to admit. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Le Bernardin gleams with understated luxury. White tablecloths, discreet lighting, staff that materialize when needed and vanish when not. Stephen arrives at 7:55, his Armani suit a shield against the uncertainty churning in his stomach. The maitre d' leads him to a private dining room in the back, where his father already waits with another man approximately his age. Ah, Stephen, punctual for once. Richard extends his hand, the formal gesture underscoring the evening's gravity. Allow me to introduce Jonathan Jolie, my esteemed colleague and soon-to-be family. Jonathan Jolie rises from his seat, his handshake firm enough to make Stephen wince. Despite his exquisitely tailored suit, Something about the man speaks of earth and open skies, a weathered quality to his skin, a straightforward assessment in his gaze. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Stephen," Jonathan says, his accent carrying the gentle cadence of the South. "I've heard much about you." "Wish I could say the same," Stephen replies, earning a warning glance from his father. Richard gestures toward the empty chairs. "Shall we?" "My wife sends her regrets. A charity function required her presence." "And your daughter, Jonathan?" "She'll join us momentarily," Jonathan answers, settling back into his chair. "She insisted on finishing a project for one of her classes before coming." Stephen reaches for the wine, desperate for something to dull the surreal quality of the evening. "So, Mr. Jolie, what line of work are you in?" Jonathan exchanges an amused glance with Richard. "Agriculture, primarily, though we've diversified considerably over the past decade." "Farming," Stephen translates, unable to keep the dismissive note from his voice. "That must be quaint." "Jolie Agricultural Enterprises controls 40% of the drought-resistant grain market worldwide," Richard interjects smoothly. "Their innovations in sustainable farming have revolutionized food production across 3 continents." Stephen's glass pauses halfway to his lips. "Jolie Agricultural. Wait, JE International, the company that just acquired that tech startup for $2 billion. Jonathan nods modestly. "My daughter's initiative, actually. She recognized the potential applications for our distribution network." Before Stephen can process this information, the door opens. He turns, expecting some southern belle in a frilly dress, perhaps pretty in a wholesome, unsophisticated way. The woman who enters stops his breath in his chest. "Sorry I'm late," Shiloh Jolie says, her simple black dress highlighting her elegant frame. "The traffic was impossible." Stephen rises automatically, shock rendering him temporarily mute. It's her, the farm girl from the hallway, the scholarship student he'd dismissed so casually. Shiloh's expression betrays no surprise as her eyes meet his, only a flicker of something that might be amusement. "Mr. Wall," she acknowledges with a slight nod before turning to embrace her father. "Dad, you should have told me you were already here. I would have come straight from campus." "And deprive you of completing your work." "Never." Jonathan kisses her cheek before addressing the table. "Gentlemen, my daughter, Shiloh." Richard Waugh stands, taking Shiloh's hand with more warmth than Stephen has seen him display in years. "My dear, you look more like your mother every time I see you. How are your studies progressing?" "Very well, thank you. Professor Rodriguez seems pleased with my thesis proposal on regenerative agriculture economics." The conversation continues around him, but Stephen hears nothing through the roaring in his ears. His mind replays every interaction with Shiloh, the dismissive comments, the condescending smirks, the assumptions about her background, all directed at the daughter of a billionaire who could buy and sell his own family's company without blinking. When the first course arrives, Stephen finally finds his voice. "You knew," he says, interrupting his father mid-sentence. "You both knew we'd already met at university." Richard's expression remains placid. "Of course. Why do you think I suggested that particular master's program?" "You orchestrated this entire situation," Stephen accuses, anger rising. "Made me look like a fool." "You managed that entirely on your own," Shiloh comments, her tone mild but her eyes challenging as she delicately tastes her soup. Jonathan chuckles, not bothering to hide his amusement. "I believe that's what my late wife would have called poetic justice." "This is ridiculous," Stephen snaps, throwing his napkin on the table. "I'm not going through with this farce." Richard's voice drops to a dangerous register. "Sit down, Stephen." "It's not a request." Slowly, Stephen complies, years of conditioned response overriding his indignation. "Now," Richard continues, "we can discuss this arrangement like adults, or you can leave. with all the consequences that choice entails. A tense silence falls over the table. Perhaps Stephen and I should speak privately, Shiloh suggests, surprising everyone. After all, we're the ones being asked to share our lives. Jonathan considers his daughter, respect evident in his expression. A reasonable request. Richard, shall we give them a moment? The two fathers withdraw to the restaurant's main room, leaving Stephen and Shiloh in strained silence. Why would you agree to this? Stephen finally demands. You clearly know what kind of person I am. You could have any man you wanted. Shiloh studies him, her composure unshakable. My father asked me to consider it. Unlike some, I value his wisdom and experience. So you're just going to marry a man you despise because Daddy asked nicely? What happened to female empowerment? Empowerment means making my own choices for my own reasons, she replies evenly, not allowing others to dictate what constitutes independence. Stephen's laugh holds no humor. And what are your reasons for agreeing to marry someone who, as you so eloquently put it, behaves like a childish man? Shiloh sets down her spoon, meeting his gaze directly. My father believes there's more to you than what you show the world. He thinks you have potential, buried beneath the privilege and entitlement. And what do you believe? I believe people can change when the right motivation presents itself. She leans forward slightly. Your father is offering you a chance to become something more than a trust fund parasite. The question is whether you have the courage to take it. Stephen stares at her, anger warring with an unfamiliar respect. And if I refuse, then you prove my assessment correct and my father's wrong. Shiloh shrugs one elegant shoulder. Either way, I'll continue my studies and eventually take my place at JA. My life's trajectory doesn't depend on this marriage. The realization hits Stephen with unexpected force. She doesn't need this arrangement. She's agreeing as a favor to her father, perhaps as an interesting experiment. Meanwhile, his entire future hangs in the balance. I need time to think, he says, finally. Shiloh rises gracefully. Take all the time you need. Just remember, your father's patience, like his generosity, has limits. She moves toward the door, then pauses. Oh, and Stephen? If you do agree to this marriage, understand that I expect a partnership of equals. I won't tolerate being treated as an accessory to your lifestyle. As she leaves to rejoin their fathers, Stephen remains at the table, his world fundamentally altered. For the first time in his adult life, he faces a decision where charm, family connections, and money cannot determine the outcome. Whatever choice he makes will be irrevocable, setting him on a path toward either redemption or ruin. Chapter 5. The wedding St. Patrick's Cathedral stood majestic against the Manhattan skyline, its neo-Gothic spires reaching toward heaven as if seeking divine blessing for the events unfolding within its hallowed walls. October sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting jewel-toned patterns across stone floors that had witnessed countless unions of society's elite. Today, those ancient stones would bear witness to the merger of two dynasties, Waugh and Jolie, through a marriage arranged more like a business transaction than a love match. Outside, black limousines and luxury sedans discharged their cargo of New York's power brokers onto Fifth Avenue. Photographers clustered behind velvet ropes, straining to capture glimpses of celebrities and financial titans filing into the cathedral. The wedding announcement had sent shockwaves through Manhattan's social circles, not for its romantic narrative, but for its apparent suddenness and the strategic alliance it represented. Inside a small antechamber, Stephen Waugh studied his reflection in an ornate mirror that had witnessed centuries of similar moments. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo fit impeccably, the platinum cufflinks bearing the Waugh family crest, catching the light as he adjusted his bow tie for the third time. 3 weeks had passed since the fateful dinner at Le Bernardin. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, tense negotiations with his father, and ultimately surrender to the inevitable. Richard Waugh had remained immovable, the family accounts still frozen, credit cards deactivated, access to properties revoked. Even Stephen's apartment, featured in Architectural Digest under his name, but paid for with his father's money, had been placed beyond reach. The message was brutally clear. Accept this marriage or face genuine financial hardship for the first time in 28 privileged years. You look like a man facing execution rather than matrimony, Richard observed from the doorway, resplendent in his morning suit, every silver hair perfectly in place. Stephen turned, his expression carefully neutral despite the resentment simmering beneath the surface. Isn't it essentially the same thing? The end of life as I know it. Melodrama doesn't suit you. Richard stepped forward, adjusting Stephen's already perfect tie in a rare paternal gesture. You may not believe this now, but I'm securing your future, not destroying it, by forcing me to marry a woman who clearly despises me, by compelling you to become the man you're capable of being. Richard's hands rested briefly on his son's shoulders. Shiloh Jolie may be the best thing that ever happened to you, if you're wise enough to recognize it. The cathedral organ began its solemn prelude, signaling it was time. Stephen took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as his father's words echoed uncomfortably in his mind. Outside this antechamber waited hundreds of guests, business associates, social connections, members of New York's elite circles who had received embossed invitations bearing the Waugh and Jolie family crests. None were true friends, Stephen realized with sudden clarity. In 28 years of cultivating his social status, he had collected acquaintances and admirers, not genuine relationships. The nave stretched before him as he took his position at the altar, its soaring arches and radiant windows lending gravity to proceedings that felt increasingly surreal. He scanned the assembled crowd, recognizing faces from boardrooms and charity galas, all wearing expressions of polite interest that barely masked their avid curiosity. This wedding, hastily arranged but executed with no expense spared, had become the season's most analyzed social event. The music changed, signaling the arrival of the bride. The congregation rose in a rustle of designer fabrics and expensive perfumes. Despite himself, Stephen's breath caught as Shiloh appeared at the cathedral's entrance on her father's arm. Her gown defied expectation, not the elaborate, showy creation typical of socialite weddings, but an elegant design of clean lines and subtle detailing that emphasized her natural grace. The cathedral lights caught the delicate beating across the bodice as she moved down the aisle, her expression composed beneath a whisper of veil. Jonathan Jolie walked beside her, pride evident in his bearing, despite the faint sadness in his eyes, a father recognizing the bittersweet nature of this transition. When they reached the altar, Jonathan placed Shiloh's hand in Stephen's with deliberate formality. Their eyes met briefly, and Stephen was surprised to find not resentment, but calm resolve in her gaze. You look beautiful, he murmured, startled to discover he meant the words sincerely. And you're sober, she replied quietly. I consider that a promising start. The Archbishop's rich voice filled the cathedral as the ceremony proceeded, ancient words washing over modern hearts with timeless power. Stephen recited his vows mechanically, his mind elsewhere until the moment the gold band slid onto his finger. The weight of that simple circle of metal felt simultaneously like a shackle and a lifeline, the physical manifestation of his father's ultimatum, and the unexpected beginning of something he couldn't yet define. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The moment suspended in time, Shiloh's dark eyes meeting his with a challenge he couldn't interpret. Stephen leaned forward, intending a perfunctory kiss to satisfy tradition. But something shifted as their lips met, a whisper of unexpected warmth that lingered a heartbeat longer than propriety demanded. When they separated, confusion flickered briefly across her features, mirroring his own internal disorientation. The reception transformed the grand ballroom at the plaza into a fantasy landscape of white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and champagne fountains. A 12-piece orchestra played as waiters circulated with rare, vintage champagne and delicacies prepared by a Michelin-starred chef. No expense had been spared to create the illusion of a fairy tale wedding rather than the business arrangement it truly was. The market response to the announcement has been quite favorable, Richard mentioned as he joined the newlyweds between greeting lines. J International shares up 12%, Waugh Investments up 8%. The financial world clearly approves of this merger. How romantic, Stephen responded dryly. Jonathan Jolie approached, champagne flute in hand. I prefer to think of it as a partnership rather than a merger, he said, his expression warming as he looked at his daughter. The best unions are those where both parties bring strength to the table and grow stronger together. Always the idealist, Jonathan, Richard chuckled. But I agree, this union holds tremendous potential. The fathers moved away, leaving the newlyweds in a momentary island of privacy amid the swirling celebration. Stephen studied his bride's profile, trying to reconcile the poised woman beside him with the farm girl he had so dismissively categorized just weeks ago. Your father sounds exactly like mine, Shiloh observed, her voice carrying no bitterness despite her words, always viewing relationships through the lens of business potential. At least yours seems to genuinely care about your happiness, Stephen replied. Mine cares about my utility to the Waugh legacy. Shiloh turned to face him fully. Is that why you agreed to this arrangement, to preserve your place in the legacy? The question stripped away pretense, demanding honesty Stephen rarely offered. I agreed because the alternative was losing everything I've ever known. My father made that abundantly clear. Everything you've ever known, she repeated thoughtfully. The mansions, the cars, the unlimited credit cards, those aren't who you are, Stephen. They're what you have. Before he could formulate a response, they were swept into the traditional first dance. The orchestra struck up a classic waltz as Stephen led Shiloh onto the polished floor, hundreds of eyes tracking their movements. Years of social training took over as they moved together with surprising synchronicity, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. You dance well, he remarked, seeking neutral conversation. My mother insisted on lessons, Shiloh replied, an unexpected softness entering her voice. She believed certain graces transcended social class or wealth, that true elegance came from within. She sounds wise? Is she here today? A shadow crossed Shiloh's features. She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry, Stephen said, meaning it. My mother exists primarily in European spa resorts these days. Marriage to my father drove her to seek peace wherever she could find it. Something like understanding passed between them, a brief acknowledgement of the complex parental relationships that had shaped them both. The moment vanished as the dance ended, and they were once again enveloped in the performance of perfect matrimony for their audience. Hours later, the reception concluded in a shower of rose petals as the newlyweds departed for the honeymoon suite at the Waugh family's luxury hotel. The presidential suite occupied the entire top floor, offering panoramic views of Central Park and Manhattan beyond. Champagne chilled in silver buckets, rose petals carpeted the marble floors, and candles illuminated the space with golden light, romantic touches arranged by an efficient wedding planner rather than genuine sentiment. As the door closed behind them, Stephen loosened his bow tie with a sigh of relief. Well, that ordeal is finally over. I need a drink. Shiloh moved to the window, gazing out at the glittering city below. She had changed from her wedding gown into a simple white silk dress that caught the candlelight as she moved. Was it really such an ordeal? Most people would consider a multi-million-dollar wedding at St. Patrick's, followed by the plaza, a dream come true. Most people don't recognize a gilded cage when they're being locked inside one. Stephen poured himself a generous measure of scotch from the suite's well-stocked bar. "Would you like a drink?" "No, thank you." She turned to face him, her expression contemplative. "What happens now, Stephen?" The question hung between them, layered with implications neither was prepared to address directly. Stephen drained his glass, liquid courage burning a path to honesty. "Now we fulfill our part of this charade until we can find a graceful exit. My father may control my finances, but he can't force this marriage to be real." Shiloh's eyebrow arched slightly. "Define real." "You know exactly what I mean." Stephen paced the expansive living area, frustration evident in every movement. "This isn't a marriage, it's a business contract with religious window dressing. In a few months, when our fathers have secured whatever strategic advantage they're after, we can quietly separate and return to our actual lives." "And in the meantime?" Shiloh asked, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his agitation. Stephen stopped pacing, anger suddenly crystallizing into cold resolution. He met her gaze directly. "In the meantime, I swear I will not touch you and will divorce you before dawn." Something flickered in Shiloh's eyes, not hurt or anger, but a calm assessment that was somehow more unsettling. She moved toward the bedroom door with quiet dignity. "Then I suggest you make yourself comfortable on the sofa, husband. It promises to be a long night." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Stephen alone with his scotch and the growing awareness that this arranged marriage might challenge him in ways he had never anticipated. Chapter 6. The morning after morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden patterns across Stephen's face as he stirred on the suite's Italian leather sofa. His mouth felt like sandpaper, his neck cricked at an uncomfortable angle, consequences of a night spent alternating between fitful sleep and emptying the bar's finest scotch. The sharp rap of ceramic against glass penetrated his consciousness, forcing reluctant eyelids open. Shiloh sat in an armchair across from him, already dressed in a simple blue sundress, her hair gathered in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She held a steaming cup of coffee, another waiting on the table between them. "Good morning, husband," she greeted him, her voice carrying neither mockery nor warmth. "Sleep well?" Stephen groaned, pushing himself upright and running a hand through disheveled hair. "Spectacularly," he muttered, reaching for the coffee with pathetic gratitude. The first sip brought blessed clarity, enough to notice the documents spread across the coffee table, legal papers with bright yellow signature tabs. "What's all this?" "Divorce proceedings," Shiloh replied matter-of-factly. "As you promised last night, quite passionately, I might add, that you would divorce me before dawn. Dawn has technically passed, but I thought you'd appreciate the gesture nonetheless." Stephen stared at her, memories of his alcohol-fueled declarations returning in fragments. "You're serious?" "I merely took you at your word." Shiloh's expression remained unreadable as she set down her cup. "You made it abundantly clear that this marriage was nothing but an inconvenience forced upon you, a temporary obstacle to your preferred lifestyle." Something about her calm efficiency triggered unexpected defensiveness in Stephen. "Hold on. You can't possibly want this farce of a marriage either." "What I want isn't the issue at the moment." Shiloh reached into her purse and extracted a slim recording device. "Before you make any further pronouncements, you should know that I recorded our conversation last night. Every word." Stephen's blood ran cold. "You what?" "Everything from your description of our marriage as a business contract with religious window dressing to your vow to divorce me before dawn." She pressed a button, and his own voice, slurred but unmistakable, filled the suite. I swear I will not touch you and will divorce you before dawn. That's blackmail, he accused, anger overtaking hangover. No, she corrected coolly. It's leverage. And while we're clarifying things, perhaps I should mention another fact you seem to have overlooked. What's that? Stephen asked warily. Jolie Agricultural Enterprises currently holds assets valued at approximately 3 times those of Waugh Investments. Shiloh's gaze remained steady. You've been operating under the assumption that I'm some simple farm girl elevated by this marriage. In reality, I could buy and sell your family's company without significantly impacting my father's portfolio. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Stephen had assumed, without question, that his family's wealth and social position were the superior contributions to this arrangement. The possibility that the Jolies might be the true power players had never occurred to him. If that's true, why agree to this marriage at all? He demanded. Why not tell my father to take his strategic alliance and shove it? Because, unlike you, I respect my father's wisdom and experience, Shiloh replied simply. He asked me to consider this arrangement, and after meeting with your father, I agreed it had potential merit. Potential merit, Stephen repeated incredulously. You decided to marry a complete stranger because a business deal had potential merit. I decided to marry a man my father believed could become worthy of respect, given the right motivation. Shiloh's words landed with precision. The question remains whether his assessment was correct. Stephen rose abruptly, moving to the window to escape her steady gaze. Manhattan spread below, a city where he had ruled his small social kingdom with charm and family connections, never facing genuine consequences for his actions. Now, in the space of a morning, the ground had shifted beneath his feet. So what happens now? He asked finally, echoing her question from the previous night. Now we have options. Shiloh gathered the divorce papers into a neat stack. Option 1. You sign these papers, I release the recording to the press, and you explain to your father why his strategic alliance collapsed less than 24 hours after the wedding. Stephen's jaw tightened. And option 2. We attempt a civilized coexistence for 6 months. You demonstrate genuine effort to become the man your father believes you can be. At the end of that period, we reassess. 6 months of playing house to please our fathers. Stephen laughed without humor. That sounds like prolonging the inevitable. Perhaps. Shiloh rose, smoothing her dress with elegant hands that bore calluses Stephen hadn't noticed before, evidence of work beyond manicures and champagne flutes. Or perhaps it offers an opportunity to discover who you are beyond the privileges you've always taken for granted. Before Stephen could respond, his phone rang, his father's private number flashing on the screen. With a sense of foreboding, he answered. Stephen, Richard Waugh's voice carried its usual crisp authority. I trust the wedding night was acceptable. You're expected at brunch with the Jolies at 11. Jonathan and I have matters to discuss with you both. We'll be there, Stephen replied automatically before ending the call. He turned to find Shiloh watching him with those disconcertingly perceptive eyes. Your father? She asked unnecessarily. Brunch at 11. Apparently our presence is required for further discussions. Shiloh nodded, unsurprised. Then you have approximately 90 minutes to decide your approach, option 1 or option 2. She gathered her purse and moved toward the bedroom. I'll be ready to leave at 10:30, regardless of your decision. Left alone, Stephen poured another coffee, mind racing through scenarios. Option 1 offered immediate freedom, but at potentially devastating cost. His father would certainly follow through on disinheritance if Stephen embarrassed the family with a day-after divorce scandal. Option 2 meant months of pretense, but preserved his access to the lifestyle he'd always known. Neither choice offered what he truly wanted, a return to his uncomplicated existence before this arranged marriage upended everything. At precisely 10:30, Shiloh emerged from the bedroom, now dressed in an elegant pantsuit appropriate for brunch with financial titans. Stephen had showered and changed into fresh clothes delivered by his father's assistant, his appearance betraying nothing of the internal crisis he faced. "Well?" Shiloh asked simply, her expression giving nothing away. Stephen studied her, this woman who had transformed overnight from dismissible farm girl to formidable opponent. Something about her composure, her absolute certainty in her own worth, triggered both resentment and reluctant admiration. "Option 2, he said finally. 6 months. But don't expect miracles." "I never do," she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I believe in results, not magic." As they departed for brunch, Stephen couldn't shake the unsettling awareness that his surrender hadn't brought the relief he'd expected. Instead, Shiloh Jolie, now Shiloh Waugh, had become a puzzle he couldn't solve with his usual arsenal of charm and privilege. For the first time in years, he faced a challenge that money alone couldn't overcome. Neither newlywed realized that this negotiated truce marked only the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately redefine them both. A journey from transaction to something neither had bargained for when they exchanged vows beneath the soaring cathedral ceiling just one day earlier. Chapter 7. The Consequences. The private dining room at the Carlyle radiated old-world luxury, damask wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, and discreet servers who seemed to materialize and vanish with practiced invisibility. Richard Waugh and Jonathan Jolie occupied one side of the table, their postures relaxed with the easy confidence of men accustomed to controlling rooms far larger than this. Across from them sat the newlyweds, Stephen maintaining a careful mask of composure, while Shiloh sipped her mimosa with unruffled grace. "To new beginnings," Jonathan proposed, raising his glass. The crystal clinked with delicate musicality as the others joined the toast, though Stephen's participation carried a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "I trust the suite was satisfactory," Richard inquired, his eyes sharp despite his casual tone. "Palatial," Shiloh replied smoothly before Stephen could respond, "though we had little time to appreciate the amenities between the reception and preparations for this morning." Jonathan nodded approvingly at his daughter. "Always efficient, my Shiloh. A quality that will serve her well as she assumes greater responsibilities within JAE International." "Speaking of responsibilities," Richard segued with practiced ease, "we've finalized the details of your position, Stephen." Stephen set down his fork, appetite suddenly diminished. "My position?" "At Waugh Investments." Richard's tone suggested this development should have been anticipated. "Executive Vice President of Sustainable Portfolio Development. You'll be working closely with the Jolie team to integrate agricultural innovations into our investment strategies." "Executive Vice President," Stephen repeated, the grand title failing to mask the underlying reality. His father had created a position that would keep him firmly under supervision while creating the illusion of authority. "The board approved it unanimously this morning," Richard continued. "You'll start next Monday. Your office is being prepared as we speak." "And what exactly will this position entail?" Stephen asked, unable to completely suppress the edge in his voice. Jonathan leaned forward, his weathered hands clasping together on the table. "In essence, you'll be the primary liaison between our companies. Jay has developed several revolutionary approaches to sustainable farming that require significant capital investment to scale globally. Waugh Investments has the financial infrastructure and client base looking for exactly these kinds of opportunities." "You'll need to understand both sides thoroughly," Richard added, "which means you'll divide your time between our offices in Manhattan and the Jolie headquarters in Georgia." "Georgia?" Stephen's composure finally cracked. "You expect me to commute to Georgia?" Shiloh's eyebrow arched slightly. Is there something objectionable about spending time in the state that produces the agricultural innovations you'll be representing to investors? I have commitments here in New York, Stephen protested. My entire life is here. Your commitments to nightclubs and social events. Richard's voice carried a dangerous chill. Those have been terminated effective immediately. Your membership at the Metropolitan Club has been transferred to emeritus status. Your standing reservations at various establishments have been cancelled. Stephen stared at his father, the full scope of the situation finally crystallizing. This wasn't merely about a strategic marriage or a nominal job. This was a complete dismantling of his former existence. You've been busy, he observed, struggling to maintain some semblance of dignity. Merely efficient, Richard corrected, like my new daughter-in-law. Jonathan cleared his throat. We've prepared accommodations at the Georgia compound for both of you. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable. Close to the research facilities where Shiloh oversees several key projects. How close? Stephen asked faintly. Our residence is about a quarter-mile from the main research complex, Shiloh explained. We believe in maintaining proximity to the work that supports our lifestyle. The conversation continued around him, details of his new life being arranged without his input. The fathers discussed schedules, responsibilities, and expectations, while Shiloh occasionally offered clarifications or suggestions. Stephen remained silent, mentally calculating the extent of his father's control over his existence. His apartment, his club memberships, his credit cards, his social standing, all could be revoked with a few phone calls from Richard Waugh. Of course, financial arrangements have been adjusted accordingly, Richard was saying as Stephen tuned back into the conversation. Your previous allowance has been terminated. You'll receive a salary commensurate with your position. Direct deposit to a new account that will require dual signatures for any withdrawal over $5,000. Dual signatures? Stephen repeated incredulously. Whose? Yours and Shiloh's, his father replied without a trace of irony. As a married couple, you should naturally consult on significant financial decisions. Stephen's gaze snapped to Shiloh, expecting to find satisfaction or triumph in her expression. Instead, he encountered only thoughtful assessment, as if she were observing a scientific experiment with detached interest. And what will happen to my current accounts? He asked, already knowing the answer. Closed, Richard confirmed. The balances have been transferred to a trust that will release funds based on performance metrics in your new position. The remainder of brunch passed in a blur of details and decisions, none requiring Stephen's actual input. By the time coffee was served, his future had been neatly packaged and presented, a life utterly different from anything he had ever known or wanted. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan pulled his daughter aside for a private word, while Richard gestured for Stephen to remain at the table. I know you're angry, his father said quietly once they were alone. You believe I'm punishing you. Aren't you? Stephen challenged. This feels remarkably like punishment for failing to be the son you wanted. Richard shook his head slowly. This is an opportunity, Stephen, perhaps the most valuable one I could give you. An opportunity to be leashed and muzzled, to have my wife serve as my financial babysitter. An opportunity to discover who you are beyond the privileges you've never earned. Richard's expression softened fractionally. I failed you by making everything too easy. This is my attempt to correct that mistake. Before Stephen could respond, the others returned. Goodbyes were exchanged with formal politeness, and plans confirmed for the newlyweds to fly to Georgia the following morning. Outside the Carlisle, Stephen watched as his father's Bentley pulled away from the curb, followed by Jonathan Jolie's equally impressive vehicle. Beside him, Shiloh stood in contemplative silence, her expression unreadable. Did you know about all this? He finally asked. The job, the accounts, Georgia? Some of it, she admitted. Not all the details. And you agreed? To be my keeper? My supervisor. Shiloh turned to face him fully, her dark eyes direct. I agreed to give you a chance to become something more than what you've been. Whether you take that chance is entirely up to you. A sleek black SUV pulled to the curb. Not his usual driver, Stephen noted with bitter awareness. Another piece of his former life excised. Mr. and Mrs. Wall, the new driver, greeted them with professional courtesy. Where would you like to go? The question hung in the air between them, suddenly weighted with meaning beyond its simple practicality. Where would they go? Now, tomorrow, in this strange new existence they had both entered through different doors. The penthouse, Shiloh decided when Stephen remained silent. We need to pack for tomorrow's flight. The ride uptown passed in tense silence. Stephen gazed out at the familiar streets of Manhattan, now colored by the knowledge that he would soon be leaving them for rural Georgia. Not permanently, according to the schedule outlined at brunch, but regularly enough to disrupt the rhythms of city life he had always taken for granted. At the penthouse, he found further evidence of his changed circumstances. His closets had been partially emptied, his more extravagant clothing removed, and replaced with business attire better suited to his new position. His private bar had been restocked with non-alcoholic alternatives. Even his art collection had been modified, several particularly provocative pieces now conspicuously absent. They've been thorough, he observed bitterly, surveying the sanitized version of his former sanctuary. Shiloh moved through the space with quiet efficiency, examining the surroundings without comment. Which bedroom would you prefer I use? She asked practically. The question reminded Stephen that this marriage, however arranged, now came with logistical realities. The guest suite has its own bathroom, he replied, gesturing down the hallway. It's yours for as long as this charade continues. 6 months, she reminded him. That was our agreement. 6 months of this, Stephen gestured expansively at the altered apartment. Followed by what? A lifetime of being my father's puppet, with you holding half the strings. Shiloh's expression remained maddeningly composed. Or 6 months of growth followed by whatever you choose to make of your life. The puppet strings exist only if you allow them to. She disappeared into the guest suite, leaving Stephen alone with thoughts he couldn't quiet and emotions he couldn't name. Anger dominated, at his father for this elaborate trap, at Shiloh for her role in it, at himself for the years of indulgence that had left him vulnerable to such manipulation. Beneath the anger lurked something more unsettling, fear, not of hard work or responsibility, but of failure. What if he couldn't adapt to this new reality? What if he proved his father right about his limitations? The thought was still circling his mind the next morning as their private jet lifted off from Teterboro Airport, carrying them toward a future Stephen had never imagined and certainly never wanted. Beside him, Shiloh reviewed documents on her tablet, seemingly unconcerned by the dramatic upheaval underway. You're very calm for someone whose life has also been rearranged, he observed, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the penthouse. Shiloh looked up, a hint of surprise in her expression. My life hasn't been rearranged, Stephen. This is the path I've been on all along. Education, increasing responsibility at JAE, eventually full partnership with my father. The only difference is that now I have a husband alongside me for part of that journey. A reluctant husband with a gun to his head, Stephen clarified. Is that truly how you see yourself? A victim? The question carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity, which somehow made it more difficult to dismiss. Before Stephen could formulate a response, the pilot announced their initial descent into Atlanta. The conversation, like so many aspects of his former life, remained unresolved as they prepared to land in his unwanted future. Chapter 8. The Struggle. Georgia welcomed them with a symphony of cicadas and sweltering October heat that felt like a physical presence against Stephen's skin. The sleek corporate jet had landed at a private airfield rather than Atlanta's main airport, where a modest SUV, not the luxury vehicle he'd expected, awaited with a middle-aged driver in simple khakis and a polo shirt. "Welcome home, Miss Shiloh," the man greeted warmly, embracing her with genuine affection. "Or should I say Mrs. Wall now?" "Shiloh is fine, Thomas," she replied, returning the embrace before turning to Stephen. "This is Thomas Jenkins, our operations manager and my godfather. Thomas, my husband, Stephen." "Pleasure to meet you, sir." Thomas extended a weathered hand that spoke of actual work rather than ceremonial gestures. "We've heard much about you." "Somehow I doubt any of it was flattering," Stephen remarked, earning a sharp glance from Shiloh. Thomas simply chuckled. "Well, we don't judge folks before giving them a chance to prove themselves around here. Your bags will follow in the service truck. Anything you need right away?" The drive from the airfield revealed a landscape utterly foreign to Stephen's urban sensibilities. Rolling countryside gave way to meticulously maintained agricultural fields, interspersed with ultra-modern research facilities bearing the JAE logo. Workers in a mixture of casual clothing and lab coats moved purposefully between buildings, while sophisticated irrigation systems and robotic harvesters operated with synchronized precision. "Not exactly the primitive farm setup you were expecting," Shiloh observed, noting his surprised expression. "I hadn't given it much thought," Stephen lied, though in truth he had imagined something far more rustic, quaint farmhouses and manual labor rather than this blend of traditional agriculture and cutting-edge technology. Thomas steered the SUV down a private road that curved through a stand of ancient oak trees before revealing a sprawling compound centered around a graceful antebellum home. Modern additions had been seamlessly integrated with the historic structure, creating a space that honored tradition while embracing innovation. "The main house," Thomas explained unnecessarily. "Your father's in Brussels this week, Shiloh, but he asked me to get you both settled in the East Wing. Said to tell you he expects regular updates on the drought-resistant wheat project." "Of course he does," Shiloh sighed with affectionate exasperation. "Even from another continent, he monitors everything." The East Wing proved to be a surprisingly comfortable suite of rooms, with private access to gardens and a small pool. Modern furnishings complemented original architectural details, creating a space both functional and aesthetically pleasing. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of experimental fields where various crops grew in carefully monitored conditions. "I'll leave you to get settled," Thomas said, depositing their carry-on luggage just inside the door. "Dinner's at 7 in the main dining room. The team's eager to meet you, Stephen. We don't often get New York investment types down here." Alone in the suite, Stephen surveyed what would apparently be his part-time home for the foreseeable future. Despite his determination to find fault, the space was undeniably beautiful. Airy, thoughtfully designed, and mercifully free of the rustic cliches he had dreaded. "Your bedroom is through there," Shiloh indicated a door to the right. "Mine is on the opposite side. We share these common areas and the study." "Very considerate," Stephen observed dryly. "Maintaining appearances while ensuring maximum distance." "Maintaining boundaries," she corrected. "I respect your space and expect the same courtesy." "What exactly am I supposed to do here?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just their living arrangements. "Your father mentioned research facilities, but I doubt anyone wants a finance guy with no agricultural knowledge wandering around their laboratories." "You begin with learning," Shiloh replied simply. "Tomorrow morning you'll meet with our education team for an orientation to JAE's operations. You'll need to understand what we do before you can effectively represent our interests to Wall investors. And in the meantime, while I'm being educated, in the meantime you might consider unpacking." Shiloh moved toward her bedroom door, pausing before entering. Dinner is business casual. The team respects competence and authenticity, not designer labels or family connections. Keep that in mind. Left alone, Stephen explored the suite more thoroughly, noting that, like his Manhattan penthouse, his wardrobe had been curated in advance. Gone were the bespoke Italian suits and handmade shoes, replaced by practical business attire better suited to a working agricultural complex than Manhattan boardrooms. Even his toiletries had been replaced with simpler, locally produced alternatives. By the time he emerged for dinner, showered and changed into chinos and a button-down shirt, Stephen had resolved to maintain aloof professionalism. He would endure this rural exile with minimal engagement, fulfilling requirements without emotional investment until he could negotiate a return to something resembling his former life. The dining room shattered this resolution almost immediately. Rather than the formal setting he had anticipated, he discovered a vibrant gathering of about 20 people engaged in animated discussion around a massive farmhouse table laden with simple but abundant food. Conversations about crop yields, market forecasts, and genetic modifications flowed alongside personal anecdotes and good-natured debates. Shiloh, already seated and deep in conversation with a young woman in a lab coat, noticed his arrival and waved him over. "Stephen, this is Dr. Maya Chen, our head of genetic research. Maya, my husband, Stephen Waugh." "The famous Manhattan financier," Maya observed with a friendly smile that contained a hint of challenge. "Shiloh mentioned you'll be helping bridge the gap between our research and potential investors." "Apparently so," Stephen replied, settling into the empty chair beside Shiloh. "Though I should warn you that my knowledge of agricultural science could fit on a postage stamp with room to spare." Unexpectedly, this admission earned appreciative chuckles from those nearby. "Honesty, refreshing from an investment banker," remarked an older man across the table. "Don't worry, son. Nobody here was born knowing the difference between CRISPR gene editing and traditional hybridization. We all had to learn. Some more quickly than others," Maya added with good humor. "I'm happy to show you our labs tomorrow after your orientation. Sometimes seeing the practical applications helps the theoretical make sense." The meal progressed with a warmth and intellectual energy Stephen hadn't anticipated. These weren't simple farmers, but world-class scientists, economists, and agricultural experts who happened to work in fields rather than skyscrapers. Their passion for their work became evident in every conversation, whether discussing drought-resistant crop strains or innovative irrigation systems for developing nations. "Your JAE team seems remarkably dedicated," Stephen observed quietly to Shiloh as dessert was being served. "I haven't heard a single complaint about working conditions or compensation." "That's because we believe in what we're doing," she replied, "and because my father ensures everyone shares in the company's success. Profit sharing, educational benefits, family support systems. Jay takes care of its people because they are the company's most valuable asset." "Very enlightened," Stephen remarked, unable to completely suppress his skepticism. "I'm sure it makes for excellent PR." Shiloh's expression cooled. "It makes for excellent retention of top talent and breakthrough innovations that help feed people around the world. The positive PR is a side effect, not the goal." Before Stephen could respond, Thomas Jenkins rose to address the gathering. "As most of you know, we have two announcements tonight. First, we welcome Stephen Waugh, who joins us as part of our new partnership with Waugh Investments." Polite applause followed, with several staff members offering welcoming smiles. Second, preliminary results from the Northwestern test fields show a 30% increase in yield with the modified, drought-resistant wheat strain. Dr. Chen's team has officially moved us into Phase 3 ahead of schedule. This announcement generated genuine excitement, with spontaneous applause and congratulatory exchanges around the table. Stephen watched as Shiloh received warm praise from colleagues clearly accustomed to her playing a significant role in the company's research direction. "What exactly is Phase 3?" he asked during a lull in the celebrations. "Scaled implementation in drought-affected regions," Maya explained eagerly. "We're partnering with farming cooperatives in Ethiopia and southern India to introduce the new strain in communities where traditional wheat varieties fail due to increasing water scarcity." "The potential impact is enormous," Shiloh added, genuine passion animating her features. "These communities could double their caloric production with the same water resources. It's not just about profit, it's about survival for millions of people." For the first time, Stephen glimpsed the purpose that drove his new wife, not family obligation or financial gain, but a genuine commitment to leveraging privilege toward meaningful change. The realization was uncomfortable, highlighting as it did the emptiness of his own pursuits. The following days established a routine unlike anything in Stephen's previous experience. Mornings began at 5:30, an hour he had previously encountered only when returning from nightclubs, never when starting a day. After a simple breakfast, he joined orientation sessions that combined classroom instruction with field visits, learning the fundamentals of Jay's operations from experts who seemed surprisingly willing to educate the city. Financier suddenly thrust into their world. Afternoons brought practical applications, meetings with research teams, reviews of market projections, assessments of implementation challenges in various global regions. Evenings featured dinners with rotating groups of staff members, followed by individual study time to process the day's information. By the end of the first week, Stephen's head swam with agricultural terminology, sustainability metrics, and global food security statistics he had never previously considered relevant to his existence. Through it all, Shiloh maintained professional distance, neither criticizing nor praising his efforts. She immersed herself in her own projects, occasionally intersecting with his orientation program, but primarily focused on the drought-resistant wheat initiative that clearly commanded her passion. The physical demands of the schedule took their toll. Accustomed to late mornings and minimal exertion, Stephen found himself exhausted by the constant movement between fields, laboratories, and meeting rooms. His designer hands developed blisters from the single afternoon he spent assisting with sample collection in experimental plots. His complexion, previously maintained through expensive treatments, reddened under the Georgia sun, despite dutiful application of the practical sunscreen provided in his bathroom. 2 weeks into this agricultural immersion, Stephen received notification of his return to Manhattan for 3 days of meetings at Waugh Investments. The prospect of familiar territory brought unexpected relief, not because he disliked Georgia, he realized with surprise, but because the intensity of learning had left him craving the comfort of known environments. "Your flight leaves at 6 a.m., Shiloh informed him as they reviewed schedules in their shared study. "Your father has arranged accommodations at the Pierre rather than the penthouse. Apparently, the building's board took the opportunity during our absence to begin long-planned renovations." "How convenient," Stephen remarked, recognizing another element of his former life strategically removed. "Will you be joining me in New York?" "Not this trip. The wheat project requires my presence here." Shiloh looked up from her tablet, studying him with those disconcertingly perceptive eyes. "You've made progress these past weeks. The team speaks highly of your questions and engagement." The unexpected praise caught Stephen off guard. "They're remarkably patient with my ignorance. They respect effort and humility. Both were unexpected qualities from a Waugh heir." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You've surprised them. Perhaps even surprised yourself." The question lingered between them, unanswered but not dismissed. That night, as Stephen packed for his return to Manhattan, He confronted the uncomfortable realization that Georgia had begun to shift something fundamental within him. The exhaustion he felt came not from meaningless excess, but from purposeful exertion. The information crowding his mind served actual objectives rather than social positioning. The people surrounding him valued contribution over consumption. Manhattan greeted him with familiar embrace, honking taxis, crowded sidewalks, the vertical energy of a city perpetually striving upward. Yet something felt subtly altered, as if the lens through which he viewed his native habitat had been recalibrated by his Georgia sojourn. The Pierre offered luxury without the personal touches of his penthouse, reinforcing the transient nature of this visit. His father's driver delivered him directly to Waugh Investments, where the executive floor hushed momentarily as he strode through spaces once navigated with entitled confidence, now approached with newfound awareness of his provisional status. Stephen, Richard Waugh greeted him with formal handshake rather than paternal embrace. "You're looking healthy. Georgia air agrees with you." "Georgia work ethic is more like it," Stephen replied, noting with mild surprise his use of work rather than exile to describe his experience. "The JAE operation is impressive, far more sophisticated than I anticipated." "Of course it is. Jonathan Jolie doesn't believe in halfway measures." Richard gestured toward the conference room where several board members awaited. "You're scheduled to present an overview of JAE's sustainable agriculture initiatives and potential investment frameworks. I trust you're prepared." The question carried clear expectation of failure, a test Richard assumed his son would fail after mere weeks of agricultural exposure. Something tightened in Stephen's chest, not the familiar resentment, but a new determination to confound these low expectations. "Completely prepared," he confirmed, straightening his shoulders as he entered the boardroom. The presentation that followed drew on everything he had absorbed during his Georgia immersion. Stephen found himself speaking with unexpected passion about drought-resistant crops, sustainable farming practices, and the market potential for agricultural innovations in developing economies. The board members, initially skeptical, gradually engaged with questions that reflected genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "You seem to have developed actual expertise in these areas," observed Eleanor Winters, the board's most critical member, as the presentation concluded. "Quite a departure from your usual interests." "I've had excellent teachers," Stephen acknowledged, thinking of Maya's patient explanations and Thomas's practical demonstrations. JAE employs world-class experts who understand both the science and its market applications. "And your wife?" inquired another board member with poorly concealed curiosity. "How is married life treating you?" Stephen paused, considering how to characterize a relationship that remained professional rather than personal, challenging rather than comfortable. "Shiloh Jolie Waugh is as exceptional as her father," he said finally. "Brilliant, dedicated, and remarkably patient with my learning curve." The meetings continued through the day, followed by a formal dinner with key investors curious about the new partnership. Throughout, Stephen found himself drawing on knowledge acquired during his Georgia exile, addressing questions with a competence that visibly surprised his father. That night, alone in his hotel suite, Stephen accessed email to discover a message from Shiloh containing additional data for the next day's presentations. The note was purely professional, yet he found himself composing a response that went beyond mere acknowledgement. "Presentation went well. Your team's educational efforts apparently took root despite my initial resistance. Board seems genuinely interested in the drought-resistant wheat initiative, particularly its applications in regions where Waugh already has investment presence. Questions focused on scalability and regulatory approval timelines. Attached notes from today's discussion for your review." He hesitated before adding, The Pierre lacks decent coffee. Apparently, I've developed Georgia standards in that regard as well. It wasn't quite gratitude, not exactly an olive branch, but something had shifted, an acknowledgement, however slight, that his resistance was softening. The realization was unsettling enough that he closed the laptop without sending the message, opting instead for the familiar comfort of the hotel bar. There, amid the polished wood and muted lighting, Stephen encountered familiar faces from his former social circle: banking associates, club members, occasional companions in nightlife exploits. Their greetings carried curious undertones, their questions about his sudden marriage and new professional direction barely masking avid interest in potential scandal. "So you're actually working now?" asked James Harrington, heir to a hotel fortune and longtime drinking companion. "Thought that was just a cover story for whatever game your father's playing with this marriage." "It's not a game," Stephen replied, surprising himself with his defensive tone. "J International is developing agricultural technologies with significant market potential and humanitarian applications." James's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Humanitarian applications? Since when do you care about feeding the masses? Last I checked, your primary concern was which club had the most exclusive VIP section." The comment, likely intended as good-natured ribbing between old friends, landed differently than it would have months earlier. Stephen found himself unable to summon the easy laughter that had once accompanied such exchanges. "Things change," he said simply, declining the offer of another drink. "Early meeting tomorrow." As he departed, leaving behind puzzled expressions and whispered speculations, Stephen confronted the uncomfortable truth his Manhattan return had revealed. His former life, once so satisfying, now seemed oddly hollow. The realization followed him back to his hotel room, where he reopened his laptop and sent the email to Shiloh without further editing. Her response arrived minutes later. "Glad to hear the presentation was well received. Maya sends additional yield data for tomorrow's technical questions. Attached. As for coffee, Thomas insists you've become particular about your morning brew. Apparently, you're developing standards in several unexpected areas." The message contained no emotional overtures, no personal warmth. Yet Stephen found himself reading it multiple times. Something about the acknowledgement of his changing standards, however small, felt significant, as if the distance between their separate worlds had decreased by some incremental measure neither had consciously intended. The remainder of his Manhattan visit passed in similar dichotomy: professional accomplishment juxtaposed against social disconnection. Meetings that once would have bored him now engaged his attention. Colleagues who previously shared his cavalier attitude toward work now seemed oddly one-dimensional. The city itself, while still vibrantly familiar, no longer felt like his only possible habitat. When his return flight landed at the private Georgia airfield, Stephen experienced an unexpected sensation as the SUV turned onto the oak-lined drive leading to the Jolie compound. Not quite homecoming, but something distinct from the resentful arrival of 3 weeks prior. In that brief moment, hovering between his past and his uncertain future, Stephen Waugh confronted the possibility that his father's forced rehabilitation might be succeeding despite his determined resistance. The thought was still circling his mind when he entered the East Wing suite to find Shiloh at the study table, surrounded by research papers and data projections. She looked up, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "Welcome back," she said simply. "How was Manhattan?" "Different," Stephen replied with equal simplicity. "Louder than I remembered." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Georgia has a way of recalibrating one's sensory expectations." "Among other things," he acknowledged, the words carrying more significance than either had anticipated when this arrangement began. Chapter 9. The Transformation. 3 months into their arrangement, Winter descended upon the Georgia countryside, transforming experimental fields into frost-covered landscapes that glittered under morning sunlight. Stephen stood at the window of the East Wing study, cradling a mug of locally roasted coffee as he observed researchers collecting data from climate-controlled growing pods. These quiet moments before the day's demands began had become precious to him, a stark contrast to his former life, where mornings were merely the uncomfortable aftermath of excessive nights. The northern test sites reported successful germination despite sub-freezing temperatures, Shiloh announced as she entered, her tablet displaying data streams. Maya thinks we finally stabilized the cold-resistant gene sequence. That's significant for the Canadian expansion, isn't it? Stephen asked. The Toronto investors were concerned about performance in their climate zone. Shiloh paused, something like appreciation flickering across her features. 3 months ago, Stephen wouldn't have understood the significance of genetic stabilization, much less connected it to specific investor concerns. Their professional interactions had developed a comfortable rhythm, their initially wary collaboration evolving into something resembling genuine partnership. Still, personal boundaries remained firmly in place. Separate bedrooms, careful courtesy, and conversations limited primarily to work-related topics. Later that morning, Stephen joined a video conference with WA Investments executives, presenting updated forecasts for agricultural technology investments. His command of the material drew approving nods from board members who had initially viewed his assignment as mere nepotism. The drought-resistant wheat initiative is now entering final regulatory review in 17 countries, he explained, highlighting regions on a global projection. Conservative estimates indicate market penetration of 30% within 5 years, with potential revenue streams exceeding initial projections by approximately 12%. And the humanitarian applications? Asked Eleanor Winters, who had become his most vocal supporter. Exceeding expectations, Stephen replied, feeling authentic pride. Preliminary harvest data shows yield increases of 42% in regions previously considered marginal for wheat production. Impressive work, Stephen, his father commented when the other board members had disconnected. You've developed genuine command of this sector. The praise so long sought and so rarely received landed differently than Stephen had anticipated. Rather than vindication, he felt simple satisfaction in work well executed. And your marriage? Richard asked. Has that particular circumstance also evolved? The question penetrated defenses Stephen hadn't realized he'd constructed. His relationship with Shiloh remained the one area where he maintained deliberate emotional distance, a final resistance against the complete transformation his life had otherwise undergone. Our arrangement functions efficiently, he replied, reverting to formal language. Shiloh is a committed professional with extraordinary insights into agricultural economics. That wasn't my question, Richard pressed. Jonathan mentions that you work well together, but he senses his daughter remains isolated despite the partnership's professional success. The statement caught Stephen off guard. Isolated? Shiloh has her research team, her father, the entire JAE community. Perhaps I'm mistaken. 6 months will pass quickly, Stephen. Your contractual obligation ends in just 12 weeks. Have you considered what comes next? The question had indeed begun to occupy Stephen's thoughts with increasing frequency. The 6-month deadline, originally viewed as liberation from an unwanted arrangement, now loomed as a different kind of ending, one he found himself increasingly reluctant to confront. That evening, as they walked back to the East Wing through frost-covered gardens, an unusual silence stretched between them. The night air carried the crisp clarity of winter, their breath forming delicate clouds that dissipated in the moonlight. Your father mentioned you had a life in New York before all this, Shiloh said suddenly. Friends, social connections, preferred places. You never speak of them. The observation caught Stephen unprepared. They don't seem particularly relevant to current circumstances, don't they? We've been married for 3 months, yet I know almost nothing about your life before Georgia. Would it make any difference? Stephen asked, genuinely curious. This arrangement has specific parameters and a defined endpoint. Shiloh stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Moonlight illuminated her features, highlighting the quiet dignity that had first caught his attention months ago. Is that truly how you still see this? An arrangement with an endpoint? The question pierced through carefully maintained barriers. How else should I see it? We entered this marriage as a business transaction. Your recording of my wedding night declaration made that perspective abundantly clear. People change, Stephen. Perspectives evolve. Her voice carried no accusation, only thoughtful assessment. 3 months ago, you couldn't distinguish between genetically modified crops and traditional hybridization. Now you discuss complex agricultural innovations with genuine understanding. Is it so impossible that other aspects of our situation might also have developed beyond initial parameters? Before he could formulate a response, Shiloh's phone chimed with the distinctive tone reserved for laboratory emergencies. The moment fractured as she checked the message. Climate control system failure in the northern test pods, she explained, already turning toward the research complex. The cold-resistant samples could be compromised. The emergency occupied Shiloh through the night and into the following day. By the time Stephen saw her again, the moment for personal revelation had passed, professional demands once again taking precedence. As January yielded to February, Vancouver welcomed the Agricultural Investment Summit with unseasonable sunshine illuminating snow-capped mountains. Stephen and Shiloh delivered their presentation with synchronized precision, Stephen establishing the financial framework, while Shiloh detailed technical innovations and humanitarian applications. The audience response exceeded expectations, with investment representatives requesting immediate follow-up meetings. Exceptional work, Richard commented when they joined him and Jonathan for dinner that evening. Several board members have specifically mentioned the compelling integration of technical innovation and financial structure. Indeed, Jonathan agreed, studying them with thoughtful assessment. The question becomes whether this collaboration continues beyond the original agreement timeline. You're approaching the 5-month mark, as I recall. The reference to their arrangement's endpoint landed heavily in the conversation. Neither Stephen nor Shiloh responded immediately, the question exposing uncertain territory neither had fully addressed. Later, as they walked along Vancouver's moonlit harbor, crisp mountain air carrying the tang of salt and cedar, Stephen found himself searching for words to bridge the carefully maintained distance between them. 5 months, he said finally. Our arrangement has 1 month remaining before decisions become necessary. Shiloh nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon where city lights met mountain shadows. The original parameters specified 6 months of coexistence, followed by reassessment. Clinical terminology for what has become considerably more complex than anticipated, Stephen observed, stopping to face her directly. When we established those parameters, I viewed this marriage as temporary inconvenience to be endured until I could reclaim my previous life. And now, Shiloh asked, her voice carrying carefully controlled neutrality. Now I'm not certain that previous life holds any appeal. The admission emerged with surprising ease, truth finally acknowledged after months of incremental recognition. The man who made that wedding night declaration no longer exists, Shiloh. Georgia changed him. Jay changed him. He paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. You changed him. Moonlight silvered her features as she studied him, assessment mingled with cautious hope. Changed how, exactly? From someone who measured worth through possession to someone who values purpose. From someone who saw relationships as transactions to someone who understands genuine partnership. Stephen took a deliberate step closer. From someone who resented this arranged marriage to someone who can't imagine returning to life without you in it. The words hung between them, vulnerability offered without reservation. Shiloh's expression softened, the careful composure she had maintained for months yielding to genuine emotion. I recorded your wedding night declaration because I needed leverage against someone I believed incapable of keeping commitments, she admitted quietly. I've kept that recording despite having multiple opportunities to delete it. Why? Stephen asked, genuinely curious. Because it measures the distance you've traveled. The man who made that declaration bears little resemblance to the man standing before me now. Her hand rose hesitantly, fingers brushing his cheek with tentative tenderness. I've watched you transform from entitled heir to committed partner, from dismissive socialite to respected colleague. And worthy of continuation beyond our 6-month agreement, he asked, covering her hand with his own. That depends, Shiloh replied, vulnerability matching his own. Are you proposing extended business collaboration or something more personal? Both, Stephen answered without hesitation. Professional partnership built on shared purpose and personal connection based on genuine respect. A real marriage rather than an arranged convenience. Their lips met in a kiss, unlike the perfunctory wedding ceremony exchange, tentative at first, then deepening with months of suppressed connection finally acknowledged. When they separated, the carefully maintained boundaries of their arrangement had irrevocably altered. I believe I need further evidence to form a complete assessment, Shiloh whispered against his lips, unexpected playfulness emerging. Stephen smiled, drawing her closer as Vancouver's lights sparkled across the harbor. I believe that can be arranged, Mrs. Waugh. In their hotel suite, the final barrier between separate bedrooms dissolved as they discovered each other with the wonder of genuine intimacy rather than obligation. Professional reserve yielded to passionate exploration, controlled courtesy replaced by uninhibited desire. The connection they forged transcended physical pleasure, emotional walls constructed over months of cautious interaction, crumbling beneath honest vulnerability. Morning found them entwined, Vancouver sunlight painting golden patterns across tangled sheets. As Shiloh stirred, opening her eyes to find him watching her, a smile of genuine happiness replaced her customary reserved expression. Good morning, husband, she murmured, the familiar greeting transformed by new meaning. Good morning, wife, he replied, brushing a tender kiss against her forehead. I believe we have negotiations to continue regarding our arrangement extension. Shiloh's laugh, warm and uninhibited, represented yet another revelation in their evolving relationship. I believe satisfactory terms can be arranged, she agreed, drawing him closer for another kiss. In that moment of genuine connection, Stephen recognized the final completion of his transformation, from reluctant participant in an arranged marriage to eager architect of a shared future. The man who had once vowed, I will not touch you and will divorce you before dawn, now held his wife with reverent tenderness, silently vowing a very different future. Chapter 10. The Second Chance. The Georgia spring arrived with explosive verdancy, experimental fields bursting into vibrant growth as warm breezes replaced winter's chill. 6 months had passed since the fateful wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral. 6 months of profound transformation for both the drought-resistant wheat initiative and the initially reluctant husband assigned to its financial framework. Stephen stood on the East Wing terrace, morning coffee warming his hands as he surveyed the agricultural complex, now as familiar as Manhattan's skyline had once been. Arms slipped around his waist from behind, Shiloh's familiar perfume mingling with the scent of spring blossoms as she pressed against him. You're up early, she observed, voice still carrying traces of sleep. I wanted to enjoy the sunrise. 6 months ago today, I was standing in a cathedral, making vows I had no intention of honoring. Shiloh's eyebrow arched with playful challenge. As I recall, you were quite specific about not touching me and divorcing me before dawn. My most misguided declaration to date, Stephen acknowledged, dropping a kiss on